Victor Solis was escorted out of his own restaurant on a Tuesday evening in November with the particular posture of a man who has just understood that the trap he spent 14 months building had been built around him instead. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say, but to understand how that happened, to understand what a woman from apartment 4B did with 61 hours, a forensic accounting degree, and the kind of patient fury that only comes from being underestimated in public, you have to go back to October, to the crying, to the wall. Marlena Costa had lived in the Harrington Arms for 2 years before Dante Marchetti moved into 4A. She knew who he was before he knew she existed. Everyone on the east side of Manhattan knew the Marchetti name, knew what it meant when men in dark coats appeared at your door and asked, very politely, whether you'd considered a different kind of business arrangement. Marlena was 5'4", full-figured in the way that had defined her silhouette since her early 20s, with dark eyes and the kind of stillness that people who talked too fast often mistook for passivity. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting, 6 years of federal fraud investigation behind her, and a private practice that billed at $300 an hour. She had never mentioned any of this to her neighbor. What she had not been able to ignore was the sound of a child crying through the plasterboard at 2 in the morning. The first night she assumed it was temporary. By the 5th night she pressed her palm flat against the wall and sang. An old Italian lullaby her grandmother's half-remembered from a kitchen that smelled of anise and wood smoke. She didn't know if it reached him. She fell asleep before she found out. Nico Marchetti, 4 years old, 8 months without his mother, stopped crying. Dante knocked on her door on a Thursday morning with 2 cups of coffee and no explanation prepared. She opened it in a flour-dusted apron and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has already assessed the risk of a situation and decided it falls within acceptable parameters. "My son slept through the night," he said, "for the first time in 8 months." "I know," she said. "I heard him stop." He offered her the coffee. She took it. That was how it began. Not with terms or grand gestures, but with 2 people standing in a doorway choosing, without quite deciding to be near each other. They fell into a rhythm over the weeks that followed. Marlena sang to Nico 3 nights a week, first through the wall, then through the actual apartment, sitting in 4A with wine while Nico listened from the hallway in bare pajamas. She and Dante talked about his son's drawings and her grandmother's anise cake and whether the building's radiator had ever functioned properly in its 100-year history. Neither of them said anything that mattered. Both of them knew exactly what they weren't saying. Nobody outside that apartment knew who Marlena Costa really was, and that was the way she had kept it. What she did not know was that someone inside Dante's organization had already found out. He had made exactly one mistake in keeping her close. He had let the wrong person notice. In late October, Dante made what he later recognized as a miscalculation, a charity dinner. Real estate developers, city officials, the kind of event where his legitimate business interests required his presence and his smile. He asked Marlena to come. She said yes because Nico had drawn her into the picture of his family that afternoon, and she was still feeling something she hadn't named yet. Victor Solis arrived late, which was intentional, and moved through the room with the calculated ease of a man who had decided every space he entered belonged to him by right. He reached their table midway through the evening. Dante introduced her. "Marlena Costa, my neighbor." And Solis looked at her with the particular kind of attention that isn't attention at all, but assessment. Then he smiled and said, loudly enough for the 3 couples at adjacent tables to hear, "Neighbor, that's sweet. I didn't know you'd gotten sentimental enough to take in a charity case, Dante, although I suppose a man in your position needs someone with room to absorb the overflow." Someone laughed. Someone else looked down. A woman at the next table studied her wineglass with sudden and intense focus. Marlena did not flinch. She did not reach for her glass or her napkin or any of the small props people use to manage their faces in a public moment. She looked at Victor Solis with the same expression she brought to fraudulent financial documents, steady, complete, recording everything, and said very quietly, "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." Then she looked away from him entirely, which was, to anyone paying close attention, a more precise and devastating response than anything she could have said. She had not made him the center of her reaction. She had simply removed him from her attention. Solis's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. Dante said nothing. He watched her face and said nothing. He filed every detail: the laugh from across the table, the uncomfortable silence, the moment she had held herself together in a room that had briefly and publicly failed her, into the part of his mind that did not forgive and did not forget. Dr. Linda Hartling's research on humiliation found that public degradation does not simply injure pride, it creates a fracture in a person's self-concept that can take years to repair, precisely because the wound is witnessed. What Solis had done in those 12 seconds was not an insult. It was a calculated act of social erasure performed in front of exactly the audience he knew would either laugh or look away. He had chosen his moment, he had chosen his words, and he had chosen entirely the wrong woman. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Marlena found the file. She had been doing a routine audit for a restaurant group on the West Side when a name in a subsidiary account stopped her cold. A shell company she had traced, years earlier, in a federal fraud case. A company connected to Victor Solis. She pulled the thread, then the thread behind that thread. Then she sat with what she had uncovered for 4 hours in the blue light of her laptop before she made a decision. What she had found was this: someone inside Dante's organization, someone with high-level account access, had been systematically extracting financial documentation and feeding it to Solis's team. The documents were real. The context had been surgically removed. The resulting picture, presented to a federal grand jury, would look like textbook money laundering. And the forensic fingerprint on the manipulation matched a firm that Solis had been paying since 2019. She thought about Nico in his bear pajamas. She thought about the crayon drawing she was apparently in now. She called Dante at 11:17 p.m. "Come to my apartment," she said. "Don't bring anyone." He was there in 4 minutes, which told her something about where his head had been before she called. She walked him through everything on the table: documents, shell companies, the forensic firm, the timeline, the specific internal authorization levels required to access each extracted account. There were 3 people in his organization with that clearance. He stared at the papers for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his face held the expression of a man who has just understood how close he was standing to an edge he hadn't known was there. "How long have you known what I do?" he asked. "Since before you moved in. I ran due diligence on your real estate filings 2 years ago. I never went further." "Why not?" "Because it wasn't my job anymore." The silence between them lasted 8 seconds. "And now?" he said. "Now you have a problem that a gun won't solve." She had already spent 61 hours solving it before she called him. Victor Solis had known about Marlena before Dante knew Solis knew. The man inside the organization, a CFO named Gerald Pruitt, on Solis's payroll for 14 months, his loyalty purchased through a gambling debt that had grown far beyond manageable, had pulled background files on everyone in Dante's personal circle. Marlena Costa's name had appeared 3 weeks earlier. A forensic accountant with a federal fraud background living next door to Dante Marchetti was not, in Solis's estimation, a coincidence he could afford to leave unaddressed. 2 men came to the door of 4B the following afternoon. Marlena opened it on the chain, looked at them for a moment, and said, "Tell Mr. Solis I'll come to him." She closed the door, sent a text to a former colleague who owed her a professional favor of significant size, and put on her coat. She did not call Dante. Victor Solis received her at his restaurant on Lexington Avenue that evening with the posture of a man who has arranged all the exits in advance. He offered her a choice, pleasantly and with considerable precision, leave New York permanently or help complete the case against Dante in exchange for protection and a considerable sum. He was still speaking when Marlena placed a folder on the table between them. Inside, a complete reconstruction of his financial architecture. Shell companies, subsidiary accounts, real estate transactions, the forensic firm, annotated and mapped in a format immediately legible to any federal prosecutor in the country. She had been building it for 61 hours, in parallel, because she had recognized the possibility of this conversation before it arrived, and had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, without announcement, and with the kind of thoroughness that left no room for alternative interpretations. "The original," she said, "is already with 3 people who will know what to do with it if they don't hear from me by morning." Solis looked at the folder. He looked at Marlena. He looked at the folder again. This is what Dr. Dacher Keltner at UC Berkeley identifies in his research on power as the moment the architecture collapses, when a person who has built their entire identity around control encounters irrefutable evidence that the control was never real. Solis had spent 14 months building a trap for Dante Marchetti. He had not considered, not once, that the woman he had publicly dismissed as overflow at a charity dinner had been building one for him at precisely the same time. The pleasant expression left his face very slowly. "Leave," Marlena said. "Not the restaurant. The city." Dante arrived 40 minutes later, having found her text. "Lexington, Solis's place. Come when you can." And driven there at a speed that suggested he had not interpreted "when you can" as a casual suggestion. He walked into the private room and found Marlena at the table with the remains of a meal, the folder closed in front of her, and Victor Solis absent. 2 of Solis's men stood against the wall with the expressions of people actively reconsidering their career trajectories. Marlena's former colleague, a 6'1" woman named Diana, who had once disarmed a man in a parking garage without spilling her coffee, leaned against the doorframe. Dante looked at all of this. Then he pulled out the chair across from Marlena and sat down. "You found Gerald," she said. "He's currently having a conversation with some people," Dante said carefully. "Good." She closed the folder. "Solis is leaving. His financial structure will take approximately 6 to 8 months to fully collapse. I've shared the documentation with 2 investigative journalists and a federal contact who's been waiting for exactly this for 3 years. The forensic firm has its own problem now. None of this required anything that would require you to explain yourself afterward." He was quiet for a moment. "You did all of this before you called me the first time," he said. "Most of it," she said. He looked at her the way he had been carefully not allowing himself to look for 3 months, steadily, completely, without the management of it, and something in his expression shifted into something she didn't yet have a word for. "Marlena, don't make it strange." "I'm not making it strange. I'm trying to find the right language for the fact that you are the most, Dante, methodically terrifying person I have ever encountered in my life. And I run a criminal organization." She laughed, fully without the guard she usually kept on it, and it changed the temperature of the room entirely. Victor Solis left New York within 72 hours. Gerald Pruitt's employment and his freedom ended shortly after. But what happened next on a Saturday morning in December in apartment 4A was the part that mattered most. Nico stopped crying at 2 in the morning. He started instead asking at dinner whether Marlena was coming over and whether she would sing the Mountain One and whether she liked the drawing he'd made of her, a green crayon circle with excellent hair. She came over. She sang the Mountain One. She told him the drawing was the finest portrait she'd ever seen, which was true in every way that counted. On that Saturday, Dante stood next to her at the counter while Nico drew at the kitchen table and said quietly, "I spent 3 months thinking I was protecting you." "I know," she said. "You didn't need it." "I didn't say that." She looked at him steadily. "I said I didn't need you to rescue me. Those aren't the same thing." He understood the difference. It had taken him longer than it should have, and he was someone who prided himself on understanding things quickly. What he felt when he was near her was not the impulse to stand between her and danger. She had made that redundant. It was something else entirely. The specific and particular weight of not wanting to be anywhere that she wasn't. "I'd like to stop pretending this is only about the wall," he said. She considered him with the same patient, unhurried attention she brought to everything. "Then stop," she said. "Some connections don't yield to calculation or force. Some things only open when you stop trying to manage the outcome and simply choose to stay. If this story stayed with you, hit like. It takes 1 second and it means something real. And if you want to see the next woman everyone counted out before she counted herself, subscribe. She's already waiting."